SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
So, good morning, everybody. My name is Ankit Jindal. I'm the founder of Friends for Inclusion. We are a not-for-profit technology startup set up with an aim to empower persons with disabilities using technology. We are in the process of creating and promoting technologies and evangelizing accessibility standards, and we are currently being incubated at IIT Bangalore, and when we are in partnership developing a couple of solutions for people with disabilities. I'll be accompanied by Rakesh Peace. He is the founder of Maxability and is also a trainer and an expert of accessibility at Adobe. And I also have my younger brother Pratik. He's working with Wipro, and my father, so we are team Friends for Inclusion today for you, talking about accessibility fundamentals. Before we really start, I just want to get a sense of the audience. How many? And just say I'm blind. I have more than 90% of sight loss, and I'll be using a computer powered by screen reader, so that I can kind of go through my slides. Before we really begin, and of course I just want to understand how many of you have really had any experience of disability, whether yourself directly or with a family member or a close friend before they, who experienced disability in any form, either directly that means either yourself are disabled. Wonderful. I think it's pretty fascinating, observation that you said. Yes, as humans we are different, we are diverse, and it really ranges, right? From even in our own lifespan, we change from being an infant to an adolescent to somebody who's young, and then really transitioning to old age. And of course, then there's a whole lot of variety or a heterogeneousness when it comes to people from different regions, people following different religion practices, gender, economic background. So I think bucketizing everybody into one human experience is also in some ways problematic. And if you really go to the slide 4, my concern with the whole definition of this with the World Health Organization had given in 1980s was that it kept the onus was all on the person. You were not able to participate because you had a physical impairment. That was the understanding. So there was a normal way of living, and then there was anything which did not comply to a normal way of living became subnormal, abnormal, or a not a very normal way of functioning, which in itself was very questionable. And the whole approach put the onus keep the person. It's a problem with the person, not with anybody else, not with the environment, right? So I'm not able to study if I'm blind because of the problem I have in my eyes. I'm not able to travel because I have some impairment in my legs. I am not able to study because I have some kind of a learning disability. So everything boils down to me as an individual. Everything is a function of my impairment, right? Any disagreement on this? I'm going slow on this topic because what I'm going to cover next is going to be very fundamental in the way we are going to perceive disability from now. And I think if you really get this drift well, I think the whole concept around accessibility, the need for inclusion of persons with disability will be self-explained. So if we go to the next slide, and this is a more advanced definition which was introduced by the World Health Organization and then subsequently endorsed by many other human rights organizations, the UN, and a similar definition has also been adopted by the UN Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disability. It really talks about that disability is a complex phenomena. It talks about features of one's own body when in interaction with the barriers or the features of the environment is when somebody experiences disability. So somebody in the beginning said disability is all about the barriers in the environment. So what it really tries to imply is that there are persons with disability. Yes, we all have limitations. I am a person who has retinitis pigmentosa, as a result of which I have 95% of sight loss. But is that what is defining my disability? No. Disability is experienced when, say, if I want to study. Today I have access to assistive technology. When materials is not provided to me in accessible format is when I experience disability. Imagine somebody who's on a wheelchair, somebody using a wheelchair, he or she wants to enter a building, perfectly capable of working on a computer system. But the building that the person wants to work in does not have a ramp, does not have a lift. So is this a disability or a disability on account of person's bodily impairment, or a disability on account of the features of the environment which is not having an accessible workplace? Any thoughts? Somebody who wants to work, somebody using a wheelchair, wants to work in a workplace, but the workplace does not have ramps, does not have lift. So is it a problem of a person's impairment or a problem of the feature of the environment? For a feature of the environment, it's a barrier, it's a physical limitation of the infrastructural barrier that exists that is limiting a person. Similarly, when I spoke about myself and I wanted to study, and if I really recount my example when I was doing my MBA at FMS, I think it was very early days that they started inducting students with visual impairment, and they had no understanding of how to accommodate a person. So I was never given material in accessible format. A lot of our professors used to refer to materials from Harvard and Yale. And I said, sir, you are referring to materials from these countries where they have a law that, you cannot discriminate a person on the basis of disability. And if a material is to be provided in accessible format, then you have to provide it. But you're giving me, and it's purely because of the ignorance and not because of anything else, not because of not having a willingness to support. It is just that often many of the professors were not aware that yes, they can share soft copies if there is a person with disability who needs it. If I had all those materials in readily available, it could have avoided me the whole process of converting the material into soft copy. Once I convert my soft copy, I think my ability to interpret or gather information from those study material was on par with others, right? So if somebody who's not disabled, somebody who does not have visual impairment, they might be just reading it through their eyes and gathering information. But me as somebody who uses assistive technology, once had content in accessible format, was able to perform on par. Of course, things became so if I don't have that material in accessible format, then it's a chance, or it's an experience of disability, right? Otherwise, I had the skill set. If not material in accessible format, you could have somebody can provide a reader, right? Many of us in the early generations when technology was not such pervasive, a lot of us use readers. So once again, it goes back to the fact that it is not only about my physical limitation, but a large amount of onus is on the society. So if we go to the next slide, and really it really talks about what is the implication of such an approach. The really onus moves away out of me as an individual with a person with disability, and the focus starts shifting towards the environment. So today we have different washrooms for men and women, but if you really go about 2 or 3 decades ago, it wasn't the case so, right? So the way we accommodated differences in gender, it's the same way we have to start looking at accommodating people with disabilities, and the range would vary much more. So today it's not because so somebody who's not able to get access to a restaurant, so somebody who's affected by leprosy, he or she doesn't get access to a restaurant not because they are they have leprosy, but it's because of the bad attitude that the management of the restaurants have. Somebody who's deaf is not able to study because they do not have a services of sign language interpreter, and not because of the deafness that one possesses. Similarly, somebody who uses a wheelchair is not able to work or mobilize because they did not have accessible transportation, or they did not have accessible infrastructure. So, do you agree to with this kind of a definition? Is it a better way of looking at it, or is it the correct way? Any thoughts? It's very important that we reflect. If you are not in harmony with the same definition, let's discuss this, because this is really fundamental, and this is what we call the social model of disability. And this is something which is moved ahead from the medical model of disability, where we said the person is the at the center of the problem. So what's your take?
I think it is a combination of both.
It is. So when I said, the definition itself said it's a function of the features of one's body in interaction with the function of the function or the features of the environment.
How are we going to bring the mental disability challenges with this?
So mental disability also, so again, it's a range of disabilities when it comes to mental and intellectual disabilities. It really starts from somebody having a learning disabilities, where we have instances of dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia. Obviously most of us have seen Tare Zameen Par. So we have an understanding of what dyslexia is. But there are other mental disabilities or intellectual disabilities, severe cases of depression, schizophrenia. Again, they are all classified as mental illness and are another form of disability. You have disabilities related to brain development disorders, where something like a cerebral palsy, or you have Down syndrome. So again, these are also caused because of lack of development in brains. But even then, there are accommodations available. So in cases of, say, specific learning disabilities or dyslexia, now there are assistive technologies like the screen readers that we use, or talking books, or just having a sensitive work environment, teacher can actually make a lot of difference. How many of you all knew that Steve Jobs had dyslexia? One. Two. So he's considered to be one of the most revolutionary minds in the world, and somebody who's changed the face of the planet through iPhones and the devices, the Apple range of products that he's created. But yet, he had a disability. There are many others who are also known to have disability. Richard Branson from Virgin Group is known to have a disability. Tom Cruise is known to have a learning disability. Abhishek Bachchan is also known to have a learning disability. Dimple Kapadia, of course, it may not be very relevant here, but Dimple Kapadia also was affected by leprosy at a point of time. So you have a range of very famous personalities who are part of, who had disability and are successful. Often, what really makes a difference is the access to an environment which is more conducive, which is more accommodative, right? Today, if we have a Steve Jobs could become a Steve Jobs in the US because he could have access to institution support where he could learn in a way which could bring, which could fully utilize his capability. Many of us in India perhaps are not so capable. We don't have those institutions which are equipped by it. What else about this definition? Do you agree, not agree? Any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, this is a perfect definition for me.
Mm-hmm.
Because we can have a correlation in the natural world itself.
Right.
We have different variety, different species, different animals who do not have a ear. There are animals who do not have an eye, the normal eye.
Right.
So they,
Right.
they have different sort of sensors for sure. There are animals who do not have legs.
Right.
If that are considered natural and normal, so why can't we consider that? I mean, people from the medical definition point of view,
Correct.
somebody whose eyes are not as good as somebody else, why that cannot be considered? As
Absolutely. And if our focus is on functions, functional capability, I think then if you really see between a disabled or somebody who doesn't have a disability, I think this will become a very important instrumental where, especially as technology developers, what's your objective, to really serve somebody who's a normal looking person, somebody who kind of defines a certain norms, or really make sure that if you have a functionality of, say, shopping, so irrespective of one's own ability, one is able to shop. What's your focus? Is it on the person? Is it on the functionality that we want to achieve? I think that's going to be very critical, right? Even at workplace, do we want to get the work done, or do we want to see in how does the person enter my room? Is it somebody who's walking on two legs or kind of rolling on a wheelchair, or somebody using a screen reader, or just using a mice or the keyboard? So I think we need to shed away our own assumptions, our own hypothesis about getting things done. How do we want people to do certain things? Because a lot of our conditioning starts from our own selves, right? Because we have a preconceived idea that this is what normal is and this is what not normal is. But really, going back to our previous discussion, what normal is really depends on my own personal environment. Today, even in this room, if I really ask a lot of you, the way you would interact with technology would be very different. Somebody would want to use a keyboard, somebody would want to use a mouse, somebody would like using a touch interface. I think we all would have very different preferences. So why then have a filter where we say, normal is for me only these 5 things, but not the rest of the things. Normal could be somebody wanting to read through and really see it all extends, and we'll see through the spectrum that I'm going to talk about. Disability comes at different forms, different shapes, and at different times, and it's experienced in different ways. So,
With different ranges too.
in different ranges too, absolutely. So, not waiting for that slide to come in. Imagine, so of course, when we talk about sight, somebody who's blind is known to be having a permanent disability, right? Somebody who has a cataract, he or she may be experiencing disability for, say, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, depending on the time that somebody is going through treatment. So does that mean that person has to shun away his work? And somebody who, say, driving, also in a way is very focused on driving. So anything else around it is not, they don't have access to that information. So today, a personal assistant device, which is, say, powered by a Siri or a Google Assistant, and many of these invention has its roots on solving problems for people with disability. Today, a blind is able to use a screen read, a personal assistant. Somebody who has a cataract would also use it, and somebody who's driving would also use a personal assistant, right? And it's a range of disability, right? And in various forms. In the case of driving, we may call it situational disability. Similarly, imagine somebody who has a, let's say an example of hands. Somebody who has a hand who's lost his hand due to an accident. Somebody imagine somebody with a temporary disability who has a fracture, and imagine a case where for a situational disability, a parent holding a child in his or her hand, so they don't have access to one hand. So really, it's not only about talking about persons with disability, but when you really create some solutions for taking the needs of persons with disability in mind, the application may extend far beyond. So, any thoughts? Is it making sense? Is it all kind of? So Braille like reading, reading Braille is also is an art which you practice and you master, and you keep getting better with every, the more you practice, the more better you kind of become with that. And I agree. So again, differently able, just to kind of give this on the semantics of it. As a part of the disability rights movement, there's a lot of dissent in terms of using the term differently able, because the whole thing is at the premise itself, outside you're coining persons different from one another. And when you really see difference, we discussed in the beginning, we all are different in many ways.
Everybody is differently able.
Yes, in that case, then everybody is differently able. But the more accepted terminology or the more accepted way of addressing is a person's first language, where we say persons with a disability. So the focus is on the individual first, the capability of individual, and not on the disability. Yes, disability is also an identity, and that is a subsequent identity and not the only defining identity, right?
Isn't handicap a better word?
No. So handicap, it's a very interesting thing that you asked me. While a lot of us do tend to use it, and I don't say it is the only definitive source of handicap, but one of the interpretation of handicap is after World War, a lot of people lost their hands. So they used to beg using a cap in their hand. So that's where it is one of the interpretation, and it is where it is being used. So you actually coining a person as handicapped, people take it as offensive as calling them as beggar. So generally the best way of reflecting or addressing a person is a person with disability, person with visual impairment, person with hearing impairment. You might hear me talking about disabled as a term that I'll use quite often, and the implied meaning where we say it is disabled, it is not disabled because of my bodily impairment, but because of the barriers that exist, is that I'm being disabled by the environment. So that's also a term which is often used and accepted. Right, and it's really a reflection on how much do we want to allow people to flourish. So today, I come from a family where I had like 6 other people in my family, my grandfather, a few of my aunts and uncles who had a similar condition. But because they were conditioned in a way and they did not get the right facilities, I think they were bounded by many things. And it's unfortunately a reality that many people do not get that kind of an exposure. We assume that it's the best way of walking is only using the our 2 legs, and say somebody who's blind and uses a cane to kind of navigate is considered to be normal. Like, we really need to start challenging the whole thing, why we call something normal and not normal. And if you really go ahead and we'll talk about the numbers, imagine any idea on the numbers of people? I think Georgie would have covered that. What's the size of persons with disability?
Around a billion.
A billion, right? 1 in every 7 person on this planet has a disability. Imagine. Is that like an outlier, or is it as normal as anybody else, right? It's something that we need to reflect. And then why do we call something which is as ubiquitous as 1 in every 7 person something as not normal? perhaps somebody who's literate and illiterate may have a very different composition, but here we have like 15-16% of the population. Many countries claim it to be 20% of the population. So I think it's important to start challenging our own assumptions on on disability. And once we understand what disability and where it really comes from and where it really originates, I think you start appreciating the need for accessibility a lot more when you are building your own products. Today, if if you join any startup or if you're part of any product development, if somebody comes to you and tells that there is this whole untapped population, 15% of the market is not tapped at all, would you want to go and kind of pitch for that? Definitely, right? But the moment we say, oh, it's a disabled population, people say, no, I don't want to tap it. It's a very difficult population. But just to get a perspective, an additional perspective, people with disabilities and their associated family tend to influence a total of $8 trillion of global spend. $8 trillion. And something being accessible automatically starts influencing their immediate family or social groups buying behavior also. So to give you an example, when the whole e-commerce website started in India, we had Flipkart, Snapdeal and Amazon. Amazon, because of its global best practices, it was far more accessible and inclusive for me, and we started doing our shopping there. Because I started doing my shopping there, the whole of my family, which included my parents, my wife and my brother, only my brother had, who also had a disability, but the rest of them also started using only Amazon. Flipkart never kind of ventured it. Similarly, Uber and Ola, Uber was far more accessible. The application interface was accessible. So we started using Uber, and over a period of time, we kind of defaulted into Uber. Now most of us don't even have an Ola cab installed on our thing. Now, for the fact that now when Ola is trying to make things accessible, still they've kind of lost the bet. So imagine how much it can influence once you start making your products more inclusive. So let me see how where am I with my presentation. But meanwhile, if you all have thoughts, any questions, I'll be feel free to ask me those questions, because so okay, there is a slide on types of disability. I think this slide number 7 we've briefly discussed, but then there are a range of disabilities. Difficulty, vision impairment, hearing impairment, cognitive, intellectual disability, blood-related disorders, age-related disorders, Parkinson's disease. Many of us have heard about that. And amongst each of these disabilities also, there's this whole range, right? So in visual impairment, for instance, there's a category of low vision, which means that somebody having some difficulty in one or the other form. So somebody having a color blindness, somebody maybe having a progressive condition like mine, where over a period of time your retina and your pixels are reducing. You may not have the right strength in your eyes, or a cataract, or a blurry vision. So it really ranges from all that low vision to somebody having a complete sight loss. In fact, most of the people who have visual impairment are actually not completely blind. They may have some residual or some sort of vision, but again, in most popular understanding of vision impairment is somebody who's completely blind. Similarly, with hearing impairment, I think there are people who are hard of hearing. There are people who are who have complete hearing loss. There are people who use sign language, and there are some people who also lip read and talk. So while talking is a function of hearing and then learning how those sounds work, still there are people with hearing impairment, thanks to speech therapy, they are able to talk. Now, does all people with hearing impairment speak or they do lip read? No. And similarly, not all people who have hearing impairment, not necessarily everybody uses sign language. So they have their own preferences. We spoke about learning disabilities. Of course, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia is there. We have cognitive impairment or intellectual disabilities like autism, blood-related disorders like hemophilia, thalassemia. So people might need blood transfusions at various levels. And in many of the Western countries, while I have listed the most common, and these are the ones which are actually accepted by the law in our country, there are countries like the United States which also acknowledges an incidence of a heart attack, an incidence of cancer, and even diabetes as a disability. So, as I said, right. So thalassemia is, it's a very interesting question, and I think it really goes back to our initial discussion. A disease is what your, a bodily impairment is, which is kind of causing a problem in your body. So you may have a thalassemia for which you might be needing blood transfusion at various point of time. But disability is because of thalassemia. Am I fine? I need. Are there barriers that I'm experiencing? So am I not able to work or sit for 8 hours in a day because I need to take 2 hours of rest or whatever? I need to take a break for transfusion. I think that's where disability is. Similarly, if you go back to hearing loss, having a eardrum which is malfunction because of various conditions is a disease, but not having access to sign language interpreters or materials in accessible format or real-time captioning or subtitling is when I experience disability. So disability is just not about my own body limitation.
No, I understand that. But
Yeah.
when it comes to hemophilia and thalassemia.
Right. So again, they also have various environmental factors, even for that matter, attitudinal factors that restricts their full and effective participation. Isn't it a good design? See, while we may be extra cautious for somebody having hemophilia and we don't want our product to kind of injured, but isn't it you by having those good practices of universal design and making sure that your products are not harming, it's equally applicable, or it's also going to be beneficial for, say, children, right? Or somebody who has a old, who's old age, because even their reflexes are not as controlled, and perhaps by ensuring that your design is not harming anybody will actually make it more appealing. And why only somebody like anybody of you here, say if you're using a mobile phone and we often tend to kind of multitask. We tend to drive and use a mobile phone. We tend to eat and use a mobile phone. We tend to sit in a lecture and use a mobile phone. So not always we are very conscious of the design, and you might actually have an accidental injury due to that. So it's good practice to ensure that it is not, and safety is a very important aspect of universal design. So yes, keep the questions coming. I think that those slide 8 really talks about the numbers, and just to recap, 1 billion people with disabilities expected to rise to 2 billion by 2050, which is going to be like more than 20% of the total population then. In India, we have a whole range of disability numbers. The government likes to claim it at 26 million as per 2011 census. We at disability sector believe that the number is at 200 million, which is at 15% of the population. Maybe the truth is somewhere in between, but definitely we need to see it's a big market, and that 21 categories of disabilities which have been identified or recognized by the new law, which is the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act in 2016.
If you consider the number of categories to be solid, then is it close to 26 million or 200 million?
So 26 million. So 26 million is only considering 6 disabilities. When we did a 2011 census, it only captured data on 6 disabilities, and there was 1 for others. And you to see the census number is also a data where people self-report, right? There's no way of invigilating what if the number is correct or not. So if an invigilator comes to your house and if you say none of my family members have a disability, he'll take that as a truth. And in India, where disability is such a stigmatizing topic, most parents, most family members do not declare themselves. In fact, many invigilators don't even ask that question. They say, if we see somebody with a disability, we mark it ourselves, otherwise we don't do it.
So for the same number of categories, the range is 26 to 200.
So the range, if you really go by number to number, we don't have an absolute numbers, even with this 21 disabilities, because the data collection techniques in our country is very poor. We've been struggling, and I lead also a discourse on data on disability, where we have spoken to Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, to the department which handles census and many other government departments. Data is a very, especially on disabilities, it's a very poorly focused area at this point of time. The politicians don't want to show an increased number because that will reflect poorly on them. But the challenge is that if we do not have adequate number represented or being shown in official records, the resources don't get allocated for the development or the welfare of disabled. So even like having accessibility or making a roads infrastructure accessible, you will not see it, right? The government will see, like I have 30% who is from say economically poor background, 50% are women, so I'll give more allocation towards that. But only 2% of people with disability, it's okay even if I give a little less money for them. So it's a challenging situation. The number is definitely, as I said, the truth is in between, somewhere between 2.6 and 200 million. And if you really see senior citizens and so many of these late disabilities, accidental disabilities, they just don't get accounted for it. And I think we are one of the accident capitals of the world. So imagine the number of disabilities that gets added but doesn't get really actually reported. We are trying various ways. Let's see, hopefully in some years we'll have an answer to that. So this is the slide 9 talks about the continuum which we discussed. So I'm going to skip that for now. Legal requirement. So I spoke about the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act in India. For all those who are into technology development, I think this will interest you. By 2019, the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act says by June of 2019, your services are supposed to become accessible. And services definition includes websites, mobile apps, including e-commerce or any sort of things. Obviously, the strange thing, like everything else in India, the enforcement is always a challenge and the awareness is a bigger challenge. But yes, there is a law which essentially means that if tomorrow, after June 2019, if I, as a disabled person, find a particular app not accessible, I have the power or the right to take it to the law, to the courts. And this law is also applicable to the private sector. So the law is very categorical in saying all establishment, and the way establishment is defined, it includes public sector companies, which is your government companies, and your private sector company. And private sector includes every possible types of company, like from proprietorship to factories to limited liability partnership or whatever. So it covers the whole range. Even NGOs for that matter. Even if you're a disabled, NGO focusing on disability or you're not focusing on disability. And unfortunately, I've seen myself that many organizations on disability, their own website is also not accessible. So yes, accessibility is a mandate. Even all those who are aspiring to work with the multinational companies, laws in the United States, section 508 and 504, have specific provisions where it mandates to make your digital products and technology accessible. In fact, it's pretty interesting to note that even if say you want to do any business with the government, and if your products are not accessible, you cannot do you cannot trade with the government. And this actually became one of the single most important reason for many of the other US-led based companies like the Amazon to make Kindle more accessible for people with disabilities. Kindle until few years ago, I think 2012 or 13, until 2012 or 13, it was not accessible for people with disabilities. But then they suddenly realized that they are not eligible to get business from the government, from the education department. Thus, they started making it accessible. And the beauty of, but the one thing which I give it to them is that they made it completely accessible, and they never region locked it. They made it available across the world, and they kind of standardize it. And thanks to that, many of us in India are able to kind of benefit from it. So a lot of these reasons are actually, while I'm not trying to undermine the efforts of giants like Facebook or Google or Apple or Amazon. They've done some amazing work, Adobe, as far as making their products accessible. But a lot of it is also from the fact that the law made it mandatory, and then they put in a lot of efforts, resources to not only just comply or tick mark, but really better it and improve it. And that's why today we see Microsoft not only making their Windows and Office 365 accessible, but really opening up the whole ecosystem of the AI and development tools. Seeing AI is a tool, it's a free software which is now available on iPhone and coming soon on Android, using the most cutting edge technologies of artificial intelligence. And it's a great solution as far as the visual impairment group is concerned. So, that's how it is. So people have, of course, it started by their own interest, also from the push from the government. But yes, many of them are taking the matter far ahead and making a considerable effort. Similarly, other countries like UK, Australia, I've listed down here. There are other countries, Israel, Norway, European Union. They all have some of the other law are demanding accessibility. 150 plus countries have signed United Nations Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. That convention mandates the signatory countries to bring in a new law which proposes accessibility. So in days to come, in years to come, you will see the talk of accessibility really picking up pace at a much more bigger scale because of the various mandatory requirements.
Has this push been strong enough for the last 2 years, I think, since the act was passed?
In India, so we've used this law very effectively to advocate with the government. So Bhim app, when it was launched by Prime Minister Modi, was not accessible. We lobbied with the government, and Rakesh and many of us wrote to the department citing the law, and that kind of made it more accessible. Now NIC, the National Informatics Center, has a dedicated wing. They have incorporated accessibility as a guideline. So there is an effort. I had a very interesting fight with Niti Aayog. So there was one particular document on SDG that they released after the law. And I kind of wrote directly to Vivek Debroy saying, we will pass the law and important documents like this are also not accessible. So immediately, like in less than 10 days, they kind of converted it and they kind of made it accessible. So yes, it is being effectively utilized. At this point of time with the government has made, the last count I had was, they've made about more than 120 sites or application accessible. How are they completely accessible? Of course there are gaps, but we have a channel now where we can actually talk to the government and say, this is not accessible, make it better. There's also a focused effort by the government in terms of Accessible India campaign, which was launched in 2015, where the government said that more than 5,000 websites will be made accessible. They said they'll focus on 50 cities, and they'll try to make their built environment accessible. They talked about making all airports accessible by 2020, and there were many other things as a part of the charter. Some of it is taking good shape, some of it is lagging behind, but definitely we are now seeing a considerable focus on getting accessibility incorporated.
And there is solid legal backing from June 2019.
Yes,
There is
absolutely.
penalty.
There is penalty. There is imprisonment also.
Very nice.
I'm glad that you say that. And there are various levels. So, as a person with disability, I have the right to go to a commissioner of persons with disability. I can go to a district level. So, from an enforcement point of view, the good thing about the law is that they've created district level committees, district level special courts, where people can file their complaint and they will get, fast access to justice.
Is the private sector actively trying to comply as of now?
So the awareness is a challenge. And there is a lot of effort that the government is trying to do, and even we as NGO disability sector are working with organizations like CII, FICCI, and the NASCOM to build more awareness. Once people are becoming more aware, they are wanting to make a change in their policies, whether it's employment, whether it's accessibility of their buildings or technology. But the challenge is really the awareness part of it. I think that's the first challenge is. The second challenge is of course the willingness after that. How willing am I to do this? In our country, सब कुछ चल जाता है जुगाड़ पे तो. Yeah.
When you say legal requirement,
Huh.
would you require all the apps on the Play Store to comply with?
Yes. If you are doing a service, if you are making a public service, and a service definition could include from banking, education, transportation, judicial, postal. There's a whole laundry list. In fact, anything and everything that comes under a service spectrum is included in that definition. And if you're serving country India, then I think you are pretty much supposed to make it accessible. And if not, then you could be challenged after 2019. So for services, the timeline was given as June of 2019, and for making existing public buildings accessible, the timeline was given of June of 2022. And in fact, the law also says that no new public buildings, and public buildings is again anything which is there for public use. So this includes your malls and whatever. They also cannot be sanctioned occupation certificate if it is not accessible.
What do you think of it being prohibitively expensive as an excuse?
So if you go to plan it in the building phase, it will not be expensive, right? Point is often, and we have seen this at various stages. While building it, if you're doing it, and if you're planning for accessibility, it will not be very expensive. Challenge is often this retrospective fitting, which is often expensive because then you need to kind of work around with the existing design, and you may have to create certain things. But if you really see from an impact point of view, and if you're a mall and you have customers, you can't be saying, right, like the Britishers used to say, Indians are not allowed or dogs are not allowed in the campus. You cannot be saying disabled are not allowed because they are not accessible. So it's their duty when you are into a public service that you make it more accessible.
Yeah, one point I'd like to add, because we are talking about the law which is going to enforce from June 2019 onwards. But we all have to look into one more factor. What is the level of accessibility compliance which the government is putting forward? As of now, please understand that it is only a AAA compliance which can be achieved by any ICT product oriented people. It's not a big challenge. But what are the other complaints which need to be in place? That even now government is not fully drafted that standard,
Which is there.
I mean, guidelines are there. But actually, what are the guidelines existing right now? It is only compliance with the AAA standards.
No, so
and
it's
some
not.
extent of blindness and things like
So
that.
there's a
Actually,
correction on that. Right now, the law or the guidelines, and Rakesh, you can add to that. Government of India has introduced a revised guideline, I think a couple of months ago.
Yes.
It is called GIGW.
Right.
It is based on WCAG
Right.
2.0 level AA compliance,
Right.
and that is a level of compliance even the W3C also recommends. Rakesh, you want to add to that?
Anyways, we are going to talk about
So Rakesh will be focusing a lot more about it, but and government has also started giving guidelines for built environment, for buses, for many other things. In fact, a big bus consignment, Delhi government was procuring certain high floor buses which was not accessible. There was a stay order put because, obviously the disability lobbied and put
I
out.
was only talking about the ICT complaint.
Correct. So ICT even AA compliance is the required, and it is kind of it is the most recommended one. And of course, it recommends that whatever elements you can incorporate from AAA, it's good to do that. Of course, Rakesh can talk a lot more. I don't want to step into his territory. Assistive technology and accessibility, 11 and 12. Assistive technologies are all those specialized products and services that we use as persons with disability we use, and these could be low-tech to high-tech devices. Really, if you really see a low-tech device could be a magnifying glass, a pill organizer, somebody who has Parkinson's disease, a white cane. All these are low-cost or low-tech devices. We have, and then of course, at the upper end of the things, we have products and solutions powered by AI. So prosthetic devices which are powered by IoT or AI, or so it really ranges. It's not, and these tools and technologies are pretty much very essential as far as getting access to or help people with disability interface with the environment. Quickly on accessibility, I just give an overview of introduction on accessibility, and then I hand it over to Rakesh for web accessibility. Accessibility, in the most simplest term, is about making your products more disabled friendly. It's about features, identifying those features and really working with those features to make it more disabled friendly. And accessibility covers things like having a ramp, having accessible documents, having low floor buses, and there are standards, there are guidelines which are available. So following which, if you are able to follow the guidelines on say WCAG, you will be able to address the needs of most disabilities. May not be all, but say 90-95% of disabilities would be covered, and that's the role standards play. So once you have standards, and there are standards available for many things now for making it accessible, if you have a knowledge of that and an understanding and appreciation of that, and if you start incorporating it in your design process, then I think a lot more things will happen automatically. So with that, I think I'll invite Rakesh to kind of talk about web accessibility, digital accessibility, and he is a leader of digital accessibility in the country, and I think he could have done much more justice to the topic, and hence I've requested him to kind of accompany us in this session.